It's Tuesday morning. I'm about to start the day in the studio. I thought today I could show you my tips on how to prevent acrylic paint from drying super fast on the palette. That's a problem that we struggle with, but I have a few tips that really help. Side note, I'll put some timestamps in the description bar if you want to jump around in different sections, if you want to go to the thing that's more interesting to you. Today I'll be using this palette. I've had it for a long while. It's made of super slick anti-adhesive plastic. I paid about $15 for it. It's a 12 by 16. By the way, if you want some ideas on how to make your own paint palette, super cheap, very user-friendly, very workable. There's a few ideas. I made a video. It's called DIY paint palette. I'll link it below and at the end if you're curious. But today I'm using this one. I like it, it works well. And at some point I'd like to upgrade to a glass palette, a nice large glass palette. I know that it's possible to use a glass cutting board on the side that hasn't any texture, obviously, that is super slick. Some people use picture frames. I wouldn't use it just because I feel like that type of glass is very fragile. It could shatter, you could cut yourself. I would not use that personally, personal choice. I have a feeling I'll cave in and I'll buy a glass palette very soon, but for now, this works really well. The first obvious thing to do to prevent your paint from drying super fast on the palette is to keep spraying it down with water. So a mister is super handy. There's also this product by Liquitex, which is a product specifically made to spray your palette and preventing the paint from drying instead of using water. I personally feel like water works really well. You don't necessarily need this fancy spray. And one note is that I've noticed that the nozzle gets kind of clogged if you're not careful and you don't clean it well all the time. I don't think I would repurchase this. I feel like this serves me super well. Good old water. Another thing that makes a big difference, which sounds maybe a little odd or nitpicky, but it does make a difference, it's to not spread out your paint super thin on your palette. As in, when I mix my paint, I put whatever colors I want. When I get the color I want, I kind of drag my paint into a little mound, because the thicker the blob on the palette, the longer it'll take to dry. It's obvious, right? So spraying it, creating little mounds. And the other tool that is super handy is to keep some cling film around, because when I take breaks, lunch breaks, if I wanna wait even a few hours, even a few days without using my paint palette, having some cling film on top of it really keeps everything super wet. I can't tell you that it's going to be wet for a week, but for at least a day or maybe two. When using cling film, obviously when you peel it off, you're gonna lose a lot of paint that's gonna be clinging to the cling film. So again, wetting the palette, putting my paint in little mounds, then gently putting the cling film and kind of pressing it down around the mound to preserve them as much as possible. And depending on your personality and on your painting style, I might suggest that you mix a little bit more paint that you think you might need. It will help preventing the paint from drying, again with the little mounds. I tend to mix maybe 1.5 to 2 times the amount that I think I might need. But I don't waste paint. Once I'm done, I put them in a small jar. Sometimes I put the colors all together and it becomes kind of like a gray. And I use that gray as a ground for another painting. I always find uses for it. And if you're someone that needs to have the paint dry a lot longer than typical acrylics, because you need very blended effects, seamless gradients, you paint in a more realistic way, you want to paint a portrait, all those things tend to require a slower drying paint. I have great solutions for you. You probably heard of retarders that you can add to paints to extend the drying time. The first one is by Liquitex. It's called Slow Dry Fluid. The second one is by Golden. It's their open medium. And I want to see how retarder fluids that you add to regular acrylic paint compared to a beautiful discovery that I made recently, which are the open acrylics by Golden. I made a full review on them. I reviewed the paints with swatches. I tested the drying time. Then I made a separate video creating a full painting using only open acrylics. I love them. I'll link those videos as well if you're curious. So the battle of the retarders, Golden versus Liquitex, and see if they hold up to my fave, open acrylics by Golden. So I'll start painting and testing, and I'll give you all my thoughts. By the way, if you're new here, I like to do art vlogs, like showing my day in the studio. I like to use different art supplies, like not just acrylic paint. I use oil pastel, charcoal. I do art supply reviews and show you my best tips and how I do things. So if you're interested in that, you can subscribe and hit the bell if you want to come back, so that my videos don't get lost in the meander of all the super interesting things that happen on YouTube. Would really love to have you back. Once I'm done painting, I always clean my brushes. I'm really good about cleaning brushes because they're so expensive, but I'm not always as good as cleaning my palette. But that's not a problem, because even when paint has dried on the palette, you can still clean it well, especially when it's a plastic palette like the one I showed you, or a glass palette. The magic tool is a paint scraper. It works really, really well. You gotta be careful with it because it's super sharp. The blade is changeable as well. It's possible to just go in and scrape all the dried paint on the palette. It goes even better when the paint is not fully dried. But whether the paint is dry or not, I spray the palette with water. Really, really helps. I wait a couple minutes and then I can scrape everything clean. It works a lot better than without any water. Also, it's really important to hold the scraper very horizontally, almost parallel to the palette, because if it's at an angle, it tends to really drag and kind of dig into the palette. Especially for me, it's plastic, maybe it's more finicky. Haven't tried it on glass. But when I hold it really horizontal, it goes like butter, and I put a lot of water. And if I feel like it's dragging in certain areas, I just add more water. Water makes all the difference, especially for the thin layer of dried paint. I feel like those are harder to peel off. The big blobs are easy to peel off, but the thin layers are kind of sticky. With water, it removes itself super easily. This was a really fun experiment. I learned a lot. I feel like the slow dry by Liquitex is the one that dries the fastest out of all the retarders. On my little test sheet, it started to fully dry at about half an hour. So it took about half an hour to dry completely. From my experience, I feel like it extended the drying time about twice as much, roughly. 2 to 3 times, depending on how much you put. I put a lot, and even by putting a lot, it was the first one out of the 3 to dry. The Open Paint by Golden worked really well. I knew that already. As I mentioned, I made a video dedicated to this paint. I really like it, but I was curious to figure out what the Open Medium would do, and the Open Medium is the one that keeps my paint wet the longest. On this test piece, I tried to keep the layers pretty much equal, and the Open Medium is still wet after I put a timer. 2 hours and 45 minutes. Granted, as you saw, I put a lot of Open Medium in my paint. I wanted to see a big difference. I didn't want it to be subtle, and it's not subtle. The Open Paint after 2 hours is pretty dry. It's still a little bit tacky, but the Open Medium in my regular acrylic paint is still wet. It's amazing if that's what you want. Not so great if you're hoping for your acrylic paint to kind of dry. It really depends on your painting style, how much you want to extend the drying time, and how much you blend, basically, because extending the drying time like this helps you blend seamless gradients and skin tones and things like that. The good thing about the slow dry is that it's a very thin mixture, so it will thin out the paint as you're using it, if that's what you want. I do like to dilute my paint pretty thin, and I feel like in that sense it's good. It extends the paint, but not too much, so it's kind of like a middle ground. It's an interesting product. And the Open Medium is a thicker kind of consistency. I feel like it's the same consistency or close to a soft body paint, so it won't dilute the paint. It will dilute the heavy body paint, and it really works really well. Compared to the slow dry, I put a bunch of slow dry. It really did not extend my drying time nearly as much. It's so surprising to see that 2 paint retarders essentially are supposed to do the same job, but the difference is major. If you like your acrylic to dry fast sometimes and to dry really slow some other times, Open Acrylic Medium is the way to go for sure, because you can mix this to your regular paint. You don't need to buy a whole set of Open paint that are specifically long drying, if you will, and you can control the amount of extended drying time by putting just a little bit or putting a whole bunch like me. If you like this, give me a like and subscribe. I would love to have you back. You can go watch this video if you want more inspiration, and I'll see you in just a few days for another one. Thanks for watching.